After 4 decades in the Cascades, I finally found the silver ghost guarding a nest of military dog tags from 1954, a discovery that proves the government is using tactical teams to protect a Bigfoot they know is far more human than they'll ever admit. If you think this is just another legend, wait until you see the genetic markers I found that shouldn't exist on this planet. That morning, the air in the high Cascades was so cold it felt like inhaling needles, a sharp, crystalline burn that stayed in the back of my throat long after I had stepped out of my truck. I was moving along a perimeter fence near a restricted utility corridor, a place where the maps get a little blurry and the Forest Service signs start warning you about unstable terrain in bold, faded letters. This is the kind of place where the silence feels heavy, like the forest itself is holding its breath. The fence itself is 10 feet of heavy-gauge galvanized steel, built with reinforced tension wires meant to keep 600-pound elk out and high-voltage equipment safe from the wandering wildlife. But what I saw wasn't an elk's work. A section of the wire had been peeled back like the lid of a tin can, the thick steel mesh curled with a terrifying fluidity that suggested a strength I can't even quantify. No tools were used, no burn marks from a torch were present, just raw physical force applied with surgical precision. As I stepped closer, my boots crunching on the frozen earth, I saw it, a snag of hair, long and shimmering like spun mercury, caught in a jagged twist of the steel. I've seen bear fur, coarse cougar hair, and even the oily wool of mountain goats, but this was different. It was fine, almost like a person's hair, but it possessed a strange metallic luster. I stared at it, and for the first time in my life, the word Bigfoot didn't feel like a legend. It felt like a warning. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly despite the thick gloves, and tucked the sample into a sterile vial I keep in my breast pocket. Every instinct I had developed over 4 decades of surviving in these mountains told me that whatever had crossed this line was not supposed to be here. I spent the next 3 days in a state of quiet, grinding agitation, staring at that vial on my workbench under the flickering light of a desk lamp. Living out here in total solitude, you learn that some things are better left in the dark, but this felt like a debt I owed to the mountain itself. I have a contact, someone who works in a private facility, far from the reach of local rangers or bureaucrats, a person who deals with the kind of sensitive data that usually gets redacted before it ever hits a public desk. I sent the sample out under a false name, labeling it as found organic material, to avoid any immediate red flags. When the call finally came through, my contact didn't lead with a greeting or small talk. He sounded like a man who had seen a ghost, his breath hitching between words, as if he were afraid someone was listening on the line. He told me the preliminary sequencing was finished, but the system had flagged it 3 times for critical errors. He didn't tell me the full results yet, only that the complexity was impossible for a terrestrial animal. He asked me if I really understood what it meant to find something that the world calls Bigfoot, but the data calls kin. His voice dropped to a low whisper, and he warned me that certain automated triggers in the federal database might have already notified a secondary agency. I felt a cold sweat break across my neck that had nothing to do with the mountain air. I wasn't just looking at a mystery anymore, I was looking at a target. He told me that if I valued my safety, I should get rid of the sample immediately and forget we ever spoke. The report eventually arrived via a heavily encrypted link, but it was fractured, missing the final sequence data, as if the file had been intercepted mid-transfer. I sat in the dim light of my cabin, the hum of the generator and the glow of the screen, the only things cutting through the suffocating darkness of the pines outside. The numbers I could see didn't make any sense. 98% human. That is a tighter genetic match than we share with a chimpanzee or a bonobo. For all intents and purposes, the DNA was telling the computer that this was a man, a member of our own genus. But there was a missing block, a 2% gap in the code that the software couldn't even categorize, filled with sequences that looked more like ancient geometric patterns than biological markers. This wasn't just some wild Bigfoot animal. This was a genetic anomaly, I told myself it was just a mechanical glitch in the lab's software or a contaminated sample. I wanted it to be a glitch, because the alternative meant the world I lived in was a hollow shell, a manufactured reality. I realized then that the official story of our origins was a lie, and the evidence of that lie was currently out there, somewhere in the dead zone, providing a trace and moving through the trees. I started thinking about the microscopic mineral dust found on the sample, a specific type of rare volcanic basalt that only exists in a hollowed-out ridge about 15 miles north of my position, a place the locals call the Devil's Backbone. I didn't know then that the thermal optic I was holding was about to show me something that violates every law of physics I've ever relied on. I knew I had to go back. If this creature was 98% human, it wasn't just a Bigfoot to be tracked and tagged like a trophy. It was a person, or at least a relative, and based on the trace at the fence, it was in trouble. I packed my gear with a sense of dread I hadn't felt in years, checking my protection tool and my emergency beacon 3 times before leaving. I didn't take my usual trails. I moved through the thickest, most punishing brush, avoiding the fire roads and the areas where the surveyors, in their unmarked white SUVs, like to park. The closer I got to the breach in the fence, the more I noticed the change in the woods. The birds had stopped singing entirely. The squirrels were gone. There was a heaviness in the atmosphere, a physical pressure against my eardrums that suggested a massive, silent presence was nearby. When I reached the fence again, I saw that the cleaners had already been there. The shredded wire had been replaced with a fresh panel of high-tensile steel, and the ground had been neutralized, not just raked, but stripped of all organic scent by some industrial solvent, leaving a sterile, chemical void where the forest floor should have been. But they missed one thing in their haste. In the soft, undisturbed mud near a drainage pipe, I found a secondary trail. It led away from the road, up toward the jagged basalt cliffs, and the tracks were fresh, deep, and spaced far apart. I knew that if I followed this path, I might find the truth, or I might find my own conclusion. Night fell before I could reach the high ridge, and that's when I pulled out the thermal optic, a piece of gear that has never failed me. In the pitch black of the Cascades, where the trees grow so thick they block out the starlight, your eyes are your worst enemy, but the heat signature doesn't lie. I scanned the tree line, the world turning into a kaleidoscope of greys and blacks through the lens. Suddenly, a bright white shape flared on the screen. It was massive, easily 9 or 10 feet tall, standing perfectly still behind a stand of old-growth firs. I froze, my thumb hovering over the record button, my own heart beating so loud I thought it would give me away. People talk about seeing a Bigfoot as a blurry photo, but through this lens, the heat was undeniable. The shape was putting off an incredible amount of heat, appearing like a sun in the darkness, but then, right before my eyes, it began to fade. It didn't move an inch. It just started to match the ambient temperature of the trees around it, a slow, shimmering dissolution into the background. It was as if the creature was consciously choosing to become invisible to my technology, shifting its very molecular state to avoid detection. It vanished from the screen entirely, leaving me standing in total darkness, feeling a pair of intelligent eyes watching me from the shadows. If you want to follow this investigation deeper into the places they don't want us to see, make sure you're subscribed. We're going further into the dead zone, and I need you with me to document what happens next. The next morning, the sun struggled to break through the heavy grey clouds, and I found the first physical sign of the creature's struggle. On a jagged shelf of basalt, there was a smear of dark, copper-scented fluid that stood out against the grey stone. I touched it with the tip of my glove. It was still tacky, and despite the freezing temperatures of the high altitude, a faint wisp of vapor seemed to rise from it. It was warm. I've tracked wounded elk and deer in the snow for years, and their trace loses its heat within minutes of hitting the air. This fluid was defying the laws of thermodynamics, still pulsing with a residual heat that felt almost electric to the touch. This wasn't just a trace. It was the life force of a living Bigfoot, and it was vibrating with energy. As I looked around the site, I realized this wasn't a place of a violent struggle or a search. There were no broken branches, no scuffed earth from a conflict. There was just a small pile of cedar boughs, neatly arranged in a circular pattern, and a single, heavy stone placed on top of a collection of mountain berries. This was an offering, or perhaps a final ritual. I felt a wave of profound unease, realizing that the being I was tracking possessed a level of intentionality and cultural awareness that no animal could ever mimic. I followed the trail of warm fluid into a narrow ravine that led toward a hidden cave entrance. I've lived in these mountains my entire life, and I know the local topography like the back of my hand, but this opening was new, as if it had been revealed by a recent rock slide. It was hidden behind a curtain of frozen moss, a jagged slit in the earth that seemed to swallow the light. As I stepped inside, the air changed instantly. It had the metallic, burnt sugar smell of an electrical fire, but the cave was cold, damp, and smelled of ancient stone. Then, a sound began to vibrate through the floorboards of my boots, a deep thrumming that I felt in my bones more than I heard in my ears. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was a low-frequency hum that made my vision blur and my teeth vibrate in their sockets. It was infrasound. I knew from the old stories and my own research that a Bigfoot could stun a person, using sound waves to paralyze their target or disorient intruders. I leaned against the cold stone wall, my stomach turning with a physical nausea, and pushed deeper into the dark, guided only by a dim red light. The air inside smelled of ozone and ancient earth, and I had the distinct impression that I was walking into a place that had been sealed for thousands of years. As my eyes adjusted to the thick gloom, I saw something that made me drop my pack in pure shock. Near the back of the cave, where the walls were smooth and dry, there was a small indentation in the rock that looked like a shelf. Tucked inside was a piece of metal, tarnished and green with age, reflecting the faint light. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against cold steel. It was a military dog tag. The chain snapped, but the metal intact. I rubbed the surface clean with my thumb and read the name. It was a name I recognized from the old-timers' stories back in town, a man who had gone missing in these mountains during a survey mission in 1954. The tag was sitting in a nest made of woven grass, soft moss, and what looked like feathers. This creature wasn't just a wild Bigfoot living in the woods, it was collecting us. It was keeping a record of the people who didn't make it home, a gallery of the departed. I wondered if the man from 1954 had been a target, or if he had been something else, perhaps a friend or a ward to the thing that lived here. I felt a sudden movement in the back of the cave, a heavy shift in the air that suggested something very large had just stood up from the shadows. I fumbled for my primary flashlight, my hands shaking, but the extreme cold had sapped the power, and the beam flickered and went out after only a second. In the sudden strobe of the failing light, I saw a perimeter of motion sensors mounted to the cave walls with high-strength adhesive. These weren't Forest Service equipment or cheap off-the-shelf security cameras. They were sleek, black, and bore no markings or serial numbers. They were high-end surveillance tech, the kind used to guard nuclear silos or covert black sites. But they weren't pointed into the cave to catch a Bigfoot coming in from the outside. They were pointed outward, toward the forest, creating a protective electronic barrier around the cave entrance. I realized with a jolt of terror that the government wasn't trying to find the creature to take it. They were protecting it, or perhaps keeping it contained for their own classified reasons. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, and scrambled out of the cave just as the distant hum of a drone echoed through the ravine, its red lights blinking like the eye of a predator in the grey sky. I made it back to my secondary camp, miles away, and finally unlocked the second half of the encrypted lab file on my satellite tablet. My contact had added a final, frantic note to the report. The 2% something else in the DNA wasn't just an unknown mystery, it was ancient beyond belief. He described it as source code, biology markers that predate modern human evolution by hundreds of thousands of years, sequences that appeared to be the foundation for all hominid life. It was as if this Bigfoot was the original blueprint for humanity, the prototype, and we were the diluted, degraded versions that came later. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The government wasn't hiding a monster. They were hiding the evidence of our own origin, the pure strain of what we used to be, before we were civilized. What do you think that 2% really represents? Is it an extraterrestrial signature, or is it the original human sequence that the history books won't tell us about? Comment below and let me know your theories. And tell me which mountain mystery I should tackle next. I spent the next 48 hours on a high ridge overlooking the ravine, watching the cave entrance through a long-range spotting scope. On the second night, I saw a group of men in grey tactical gear arrive in a silent, matte black helicopter that didn't appear on any flight trackers. They didn't go into the cave with tools of conflict drawn or flashbangs ready. Instead, they moved with a strange kind of reverence. They left crates of supplies, specialized high-calorie proteins, medical kits, and what looked like containers of fresh, filtered water. They treated the area like a Bigfoot sanctuary, a holy site. That's when I saw him for the first time in the light, the silver one. He stepped out from behind a basalt pillar, his fur shimmering like a mountain stream in the moonlight, his movements fluid and powerful. He was massive, his shoulders as wide as a doorway, his face a haunting, beautiful mix of ancient wisdom and deep, abiding pain. He didn't look like an animal or a primate. He looked like a king in exile. I felt a sense of overwhelming shame, realizing that while I had been tracking him like a specimen, he had been surviving in a world that had forgotten his name. Before he appeared, the air on the ridge grew heavy, and my peripheral vision began to swim with a familiar static that I now recognized as a precursor to his presence. Then, he was there. He turned his head toward my ridge, and for a second that felt like an eternity, our eyes met through the glass of the scope. There was no growl, no display of teeth, no animal aggression. He simply raised a hand, a massive, 5-fingered hand with nails like obsidian, and touched his chest. It was the same gesture I had seen in my mind when I found the offering of berries and cedar. He knew I was there. He had always known. This Bigfoot wasn't afraid of me. He was acknowledging me as a witness. Then, with a speed that defied his massive size, he vanished back into the shadows of the basalt as if he were made of smoke. I realized then that the security around these mountains wasn't just to keep curious humans out. It was a desperate attempt to keep the last of the originals from being discovered by a world that would surely end them if they knew the truth. On my trek back to civilization, I realized I was being followed. The twin headlights of a black SUV appeared in my rearview mirror, cutting through the thick mountain fog like hunting eyes, never getting closer, but never falling back. It shadowed me for 3 miles on the winding service road, never pulling me over or making a move, just staying close enough to let me know I was no longer a private citizen in these woods. When I finally reached my cabin, my sanctuary for 40 years, I found the front door unlocked and swaying in the wind. Nothing of value was taken, my tools and electronics were untouched, but my journals had been moved, the pages fanned out across the table as if someone had been searching for a specific date or location. Someone had read through 40 years of my life in an afternoon, looking for any mention of the Bigfoot I had found. I felt a cold realization that my safety was now tied to my silence, and that the truth I was carrying was a weight I might have to bear alone for the rest of my days. But the truth is heavier than the lies they tell us. If you believe this story needs to be told, if you believe we deserve to know who we really are and where we came from, share this video with anyone who is ready to listen. I went back to the fence line one last time before the winter snows blocked the pass. I had a small piece of the silver hair left in a different vial, the last physical evidence I possessed. I didn't send it to another lab. I didn't give it to a researcher. I took it back to the jagged wire where I had first found it and tied it back to the steel with a piece of simple twine. It was a small gesture, a way of returning what was stolen and showing that I was no longer a hunter. As I stood there, the forest went completely silent. No wind, no birds, not even the sound of the distant highway. Then, from high up on the basalt ridge, I heard it. A single, long vocalization that sounded like a name being called across a great, ancient distance. It wasn't a roar of anger or a scream of ending. It was the sound of a Bigfoot offering a profound recognition. I knew then that the Silver One was still there, guarding the door to a history we are not yet allowed to see, and that he knew I had kept the faith. I sit on my porch now, watching the sun dip behind the jagged Gifford Pinchot peaks, the shadows stretching long across the valley. I know they are watching me, the men in the grey gear, the agencies that keep the maps blurry and my mailbox empty. But I also know he is out there, living in the spaces between the trees. The 98% human, the 2% something else. He is the guardian of the original flame, the one who stayed behind while we forgot how to listen to the mountain and the wind. I don't know if I will ever see Bigfoot again with my own eyes, but I know that the mystery isn't something to be solved or exploited. It's something to be protected. The woods are deep, and the secrets are even deeper than the roots of the mountains. If you're ready to keep looking for the truth, stay with me on this journey. The investigation is just beginning, and the mountain still has stories to tell for those who know how to listen. Subscribe and keep your eyes on the tree line. We aren't alone out here, and we never have been.